You are on your knees in the sand. It burns through your skin. Your legs ache, locked in place, trembling from strain and heat. An iron collar clamps around your neck, cinched so tightly that every swallow feels like choking. A chain runs from it, linking you to 11 other women, close enough that you can feel their movements, close enough to hear them breathe. One is crying, quietly now. Another whispers a prayer, syllables unfamiliar, a language you don't understand, but somehow recognizes desperation. A shadow cuts across your face. For half a second, the sun disappears. Relief washes over you, brief, cruel. Then hands seize your jaw. Your mouth is forced open. Fingers push inside, pressing against your teeth, your gums, the back of your throat. You gag. Your body tries to recoil, but the chain jerks tight. He doesn't stop. He inspects your tongue for sickness, pulls your eyelids wide, checks the whites of your eyes, hooks a finger inside your lip and drags it down, exposing your mouth like livestock at a market. Because that's what you are now. You don't know it yet, but this inspection will decide the rest of your life. For the man doing the inspecting, this moment carried no weight at all. He would forget your face before the sun set. 12 days ago, this wasn't your world. 12 days ago, you were the daughter of a village leader, somewhere in the Sahel. You woke to the sound of your mother calling your name each morning. You knew the paths between the huts. You knew where the shade fell at midday. You had a name that meant something. She's dead now. You watched her die, and you kept walking afterward, because the men with swords made the rule clear, without speaking it aloud. Stop moving, and you join her. In Arabic, there is a word for what you've become, Jariya. It translates loosely as slave girl. But that translation is clean, too gentle. It hides the truth. What the word actually means is this. Your body is inventory. Your future belongs to whoever pays for it. Your past no longer exists. The man examining you steps back. He gives a small nod. Another man steps forward, holding a leather pouch. You hear the sound of coins shifting inside. Metal changes hands. You have just been sold, for the third time this month. And where they are taking you, historians will spend centuries pretending never existed. This is the Arab slave trade. 14 million Africans. More than 13 centuries. That length of time matters more than the number. Systems don't survive 13 centuries unless they are carefully maintained. A system so efficient at erasing human beings that almost no descendants remain to tell the story. If this history matters to you, subscribe to Grim History, because we do not turn away from the stories the world tried to bury. You already know about the Atlantic slave trade, ships, chains, plantations in the Americas, 12 million Africans transported across the ocean over roughly 400 years. That history has museums, memorials, films. Children are taught it in classrooms. Politicians reference it in speeches. But there was another slave trade, older, longer, and by some measures, even larger. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century, following the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests that swept across North Africa. It did not end until the 20th century. Saudi Arabia officially abolished slavery in 1962. Mauritania followed in 1981. These are not ancient dates. These are years your grandparents remember. There are people alive today who were born into societies where this trade still operated legally. Between roughly 650 AD and 1900 AD, historians estimate that between 14 and 17 million Africans were taken from their homes and transported to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some scholars believe the true number is higher. Records were inconsistent, deaths went uncounted, entire caravans vanished without documentation. More people, over a longer span of time, moved through routes that crossed 3 continents. And yet, almost no one talks about it. Why? Because this trade was engineered to leave nothing behind, and it worked. In the United States today, there are around 45 million people of African descent. Their existence is evidence. Their communities keep memory alive. Their struggles ensure the history cannot disappear. But in the Middle East, after 13 centuries of importing millions of Africans, there is almost nothing. small communities in Yemen, scattered populations in southern Iraq, a few thousand Afro-Arabs in Morocco, tiny remnants where there should be millions. So where did 14 million people go? Historians searched for migrations. They searched for lost records. They did not want the answer they eventually found. The answer is the darkest part of this entire story. The men were castrated. This is not speculation. It is not rumour. It is documented across hundreds of primary sources spanning centuries. Arab slave traders systematically castrated African males at rates estimated between 80 and 90%. The procedure was carried out at specific points along the trade routes. Egyptian monasteries became infamous for it. Coptic Christian monks developed techniques that slightly improved survival rates. Slightly. For every man who survived, 3 to 5 died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Some accounts suggest even higher death rates. Consider the math. If a trader wanted 100 living eunuchs to sell at market, he might begin with 400 or 500 men. To the traders, this was not massacre. It was cost. The rest died screaming in the sand. The logic was cruel but efficient. Castrated slaves could not reproduce. They could not form families. They could not build communities strong enough to resist. They could not leave descendants who might one day demand justice. They worked, they aged, they died, and they were replaced by the next raid, generation after generation, for over 1,300 years. But the women served a different purpose entirely. They were kept intact, kept fertile, preserved specifically for what their bodies could produce. And what happened to them is a story that historical records describe only in euphemism, in careful wording, in deliberate silences, in details considered too indecent to record openly. The system required constant supply. Arab merchants were not usually raiders themselves. They were businessmen, operators of vast commercial networks stretching across continents. They did not storm villages personally. Instead, they built economic systems that encouraged Africans to capture and sell one another. Firearms flowed into the continent. European guns traded through Arab middlemen. Textiles, luxury goods, salt, precious in sub-Saharan regions. And in return, human beings. The kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, became one of the major suppliers. Its economy grew dependent on annual slave raids against neighbouring peoples. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled the East African routes. The Funj Sultanate dominated the Nile corridor. Tuareg groups controlled trans-Saharan passages. African kingdoms went to war not for land, but for people. Captured survivors were marched to collection points and sold to Arab traders. The cycle fed itself endlessly. More guns meant more successful raids. More raids meant more captives. More captives meant more buying power. More buying power meant more guns. A machine that consumed human suffering and grew stronger with every life it devoured. Villages were attacked at dawn when resistance was weakest. Warriors surrounded settlements while people slept. The assault was sudden, overwhelming. Men who fought back were killed immediately. Men who surrendered were inspected on the spot. Age, health, strength. Young, strong men were separated for castration and sale. Older men with little market value were often killed where they stood. But the women faced a different calculation. Traders examined them carefully. Age mattered. Girls too young required years of feeding before becoming profitable. Women too old brought reduced prices. The ideal age lay in between. And what happened to the women who met those ideal criteria is where this story goes next. The most valuable age range fell between roughly 13 and 25 years old enough to survive what lay ahead, young enough to be exploited for decades. Appearance mattered a great deal. Arab markets had precise preferences, understood instinctively by experienced traders. Certain body types, certain facial features, subtle differences that could double or triple a price depending on the destination. Different regions wanted different things. Across nearly every market, women from Ethiopia commanded the highest prices. Their features were widely considered desirable. A woman from those regions could sell for twice, sometimes 3 times, what others brought. Those who met the preferred criteria were separated immediately. They received slightly better treatment during transport, marginally more care, not out of mercy, never mercy. Damaged merchandise lost value. Preserving the investment was simply good business. Families were broken apart at capture sites or centralized collection points. Mothers torn from children, husbands ripped from wives, sisters dragged away from brothers. Lifelong bonds were destroyed in minutes, with no chance of reunion. European missionaries and explorers who witnessed these separations left written accounts of scenes they struggled to describe. The screaming, the desperate grasping as families clung to one another for seconds longer. Final touches of skin, final sounds of familiar voices. Then the chains tightened, and people who had shared entire lives were pulled in opposite directions, never to meet again, never to know what became of one another. One missionary wrote that the cries followed him for years afterward, that even decades later, he could still hear mothers calling for children who would never answer. No matter how far he travelled, the sounds came with him. Those cries echoed across Africa for 13 centuries, and almost no one beyond the continent ever heard them. Then came the Sahara. The trans-Saharan routes were not measured in distance but in death. Picture the span from New York to Denver. Now imagine crossing it on foot, in chains with almost no water, beneath a sun that kills. From collection points in sub-Saharan Africa to the great northern markets, Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, Marrakesh, caravans travelled staggering distances. Some routes exceeded 2,000 miles, others stretched even farther. The journey took 2 to 3 months under ideal conditions. Conditions were never ideal. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. Daytime temperatures routinely climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sand becomes hot enough to blister skin on contact. Shade is non-existent for hundreds of miles. Then night arrives. Temperatures plunge. The same desert that scorched bodies by day could freeze them after dark. The sheer swing alone killed countless people. Water became the most valuable resource, rationed with ruthless calculation. Camels needed water to survive. Camels were costly. Camels carried goods. Slaves were cheaper than animals. Slaves could be replaced. So water went to the camels first. Whatever remained, if anything remained, went to the humans. Lips split until they bled, tongues swelled, throats burned, and always the knowledge that there was nothing to drink, with hundreds of miles still ahead. Food was scarce, dried dates, sometimes bits of meat, just enough to keep bodies moving. Never enough to preserve strength over months of walking. Death was constant. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30% of captives died during Saharan crossings. Some caravans lost half of their human cargo. Others arrived with losses exceeding 60%. Those who collapsed were abandoned. By the time this happened, no one reacted. That was how the caravan knew it was working. Stopping to bury the dead slowed the caravan. Stopping to help the dying risked losing the living. The calculations left no room for compassion. People were left sitting in the sand, too weak to continue, watching the caravan disappear as they waited to die. Over time, the routes themselves became marked by bones. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer who crossed the Sahara in the 1850s, recorded what he saw. He described paths littered with human skeletons. In some valleys, the remains were so dense that it was difficult not to step on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun, rib cages half buried in drifting sand. These were not ancient bones, they were recent, fresh additions to trails that had been collecting bodies for over 1,000 years. René Caillier documented similar scenes along western routes. He wrote of valleys that appeared white from a distance, not from sand, but from accumulated remains. Gustave Nachtigall described regions where skulls and bones gave the ground a pavement-like hardness beneath one's feet. Hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions, over 13 centuries. Their remains scattered across the largest desert on Earth, marking the paths that consumed them. Silent evidence of a system the world chose not to see, for the women who survived, who somehow endured the thirst, the heat, the cold, the starvation. Arrival at a North African port meant only that the immediate dying had stopped. Nothing more. Survival carried its own price. Many arrived broken in ways that left no visible marks. Their bodies completed the journey. Their spirits did not. What awaited them next was not an end, but a transformation. The slave markets of the Arab world were ancient institutions, refined over centuries into systems of terrifying efficiency. By the time European observers began documenting them, Cairo's market had operated continuously for over 1,000 years. Generation after generation of traders perfected the routines: pricing, classification, inspection. Buyers arrived from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman nobles from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy households from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from the Gulf seeking domestic servants. Even Europeans, despite official bans, found ways to participate. Markets were divided by category: unskilled labourers in one section, skilled workers in another, domestic servants elsewhere, and behind screens, in restricted areas, women intended for private sale. The evaluation process was methodical. To someone seeing it for the first time, the calm was the most disturbing part. Teeth were examined first. Dental condition revealed age and health. Experienced buyers could estimate remaining years of usefulness from teeth alone. Then skin tour searched for disease, scars, flaws. Hair was inspected for texture and length. Then everything else. Those paying the highest prices demanded the most thorough assessments. The examinations were invasive, intimate, carried out with the same detachment a butcher might show when judging livestock. European travellers left accounts so explicit that publishers often censored them. One British observer in the 1830s wrote that the women were forced to walk, turn, and present themselves in ways unfit for polite description, examined with the same cold calculation a horse trader applies to a mare. Prices varied by origin, appearance, and intended use. Common women sold for modest amounts. Women with preferred features fetched far higher sums. Young virgins from favoured regions could sell for the equivalent of several years' wages. The highest prices were paid quietly, through agents acting on behalf of the wealthiest households. Zanzibar became the largest slave market in the Indian Ocean world. At its height, roughly 50,000 enslaved people passed through each year. The island's economy revolved almost entirely around human trade. David Livingstone witnessed the system firsthand. What he saw altered him permanently. He wrote that no description could exaggerate its evils, that the scenes were so horrifying he tried, unsuccessfully, to erase them from memory. The market remained open until 1873, when British pressure finally forced its closure. A treaty was signed. Auctions were officially banned, but the trade did not end. It simply went underground. Ships sailed at night, transactions moved into shadows, and what happened to the women after they were purchased depended entirely on who claimed them next. Sales continued out of sight. Transactions moved into back rooms, courtyards, private residences. Demand never slowed. Profits remained enormous. And wherever demand exists, supply finds a way. What happened to these women after purchase depended entirely on who acquired them, and for what purpose. The wealthiest buyers were assembling harems. Ottoman sultans maintained collections, numbering in the hundreds, sometimes the thousands. The imperial harem inside Topkapi Palace in Constantinople housed as many as 2,000 women at various points in history. Provincial governors and lesser nobles kept smaller harems, scaled to their wealth. Even moderately successful merchants often owned several women for household labour and personal use. The harem, however, was far more complex than the modern word suggests. It was not simply about access, it was power. It was a political institution where women competed constantly for favour. Bearing a son for a powerful man could change everything. The mother of a future sultan wielded influence that rivaled ministers and generals, so alliances formed. Rivalries hardened, Plots unfolded quietly. Poison was common. Political maneuvering as intricate as anything in the official court played out behind guarded doors. For a captured African woman, entry into a harem meant the deliberate destruction of her former self. She was given a new name. Her language was forbidden. Her religion was replaced. Her past was erased, then reconstructed into something useful. She was trained relentlessly: how to move, how to stand, how to speak, how to serve. What behavior was rewarded? What mistakes were punished? Over time, nothing remained of who she had been. The person her family once loved no longer existed, replaced by someone shaped entirely for ownership. A small number of women navigated this system successfully. Very few rose to real power. Kösem Sultan ruled Ottoman politics from behind the throne for decades. She began her life as an enslaved girl, taken from a small Greek village. Hürrem Sultan achieved something almost unheard of. She became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. History remembers them precisely because they were extraordinary. The system did not create Kösem Sultan. It destroyed thousands of women to produce one exception. For every woman whose name survived, thousands more lived and died unnamed, used until no longer useful, then quietly discarded. Women sold to less wealthy buyers faced different lives. Many became domestic servants with additional obligations. They cooked, they cleaned, they raised children, and they submitted whenever demanded. There was no concept of consent, no right to refuse. Islamic law did offer limited protections, on paper. A slave woman who bore her master's child was called an walad, mother of a child. She could no longer be sold. Her child was legally free. When her master died, she was supposed to gain her freedom. But protections required enforcement. In reality, enforcement was inconsistent. These rights applied only after pregnancy. Before that moment, she remained property. Children born from these unions were legally free and often acknowledged. Some rose to prominence. Multiple sultans were born to enslaved mothers. But the mothers themselves remained enslaved unless explicitly freed. Whatever intimacy occurred was compelled, never chosen. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations. Physical features blended, African ancestry diluted with each generation until it faded from view, until it vanished. This was the final erasure, not just of individuals, but of their descendants, not just of lives, but of any evidence those lives had ever existed. If you're still watching, stay with this, because this story does not end here. The Arab slave trade did not conclude with a dramatic abolition. There was no Emancipation Proclamation, no civil war fought over it, no defining moment when the world declared it finished. Instead, it faded slowly, reluctantly. Change came from outside pressure, not internal reckoning. British naval forces began shutting down East African routes in the late 19th century. The Royal Navy hunted slave ships at sea. Colonial administrations disrupted trans-Saharan networks as European powers divided Africa among themselves. International pressure forced formal abolitions throughout the 20th century. But the legacy left behind was not monuments, it was absence. Today, in the Middle East, there are virtually no descendants of the 14 million Africans taken there. The men were castrated. The women's children were absorbed into surrounding populations. Their heritage dissolved until nothing remained. This is why silence is not accidental. It is the final outcome of the design. The victims vanished so completely that most people do not even know they existed. No films tell their stories, no holidays mark their suffering, no leaders speak their names. In 2020, archaeologists working in Libya uncovered a mass grave, hundreds of remains. Analysis showed they were sub-Saharan Africans who died in the 18th or 19th century. Almost certainly enslaved people who collapsed during the crossing and were left behind as caravans moved on. They had no names recorded anywhere, no descendants to claim them, no one alive who remembered them. No grave markers, no memorials, only bones in the sand, silent proof of a catastrophe the world chose to forget. The Atlantic slave trade left 45 million descendants who keep that history alive. The Arab slave trade left silence, nothing but silence. 14 million people erased so completely that we do not even know their names. The woman in the market, the one whose teeth were inspected, whose body was judged, whose humanity was stripped away piece by piece. We will never know what she was called before they took her name. The name her mother whispered, the name her village knew. She might have ended up in a Cairo harem, competing for scraps of attention from a man who owned her. She might have lived in a household in Baghdad, cooking and cleaning, summoned whenever desired. She might have faded into a corner of a palace in Istanbul, forgotten as youth passed. She might have borne children who never learned her language, who never heard her songs, who never knew her stories or where she came from. She might have died in the desert, her bones joining millions of others along routes civilization pretends never existed. What we do know is this: nothing about this story survives unless it is carried forward deliberately. She existed, she suffered, she endured what no human being should ever endure. And for 13 centuries, millions like her sustained a machine designed to consume them entirely. The Atlantic slave trade has museums, memorials, days of remembrance. This history has sand covering bones no one will ever identify. Remember her not as a number, not as a statistic. Remember her as someone's daughter. Someone who laughed once, someone who had a name before it was erased. That may be the only memorial these 14 million ever receive. If this story mattered to you, drop a like. Subscribe if you haven't already. And tell me in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from.